Hello, my name is Martin Dittus. Right now I'm a data scientist and digital geographer at the Oxford Internet Institute. At the time of the research that I'm about to show you, I was a PhD student at UCL in London. And the work I'm showing you was produced together with Licia Capra. The general context of the work is a recurring problem in online platforms relating to social knowledge production. Crowdsourcing platforms, online news platforms that accept contributions by the public, platforms like Wikipedia and so on, where there's a dual problem that these platforms need to address. On one hand, it's a problem of quality control. How do we deal with the flood of contributions? How do we identify contributions that we want to retain versus those we maybe want to discard or refine? And on the other hand, it's an onboarding problem. How do we teach newcomers how to interact on the platform, how to contribute to the platform, and how to produce high-quality contributions? A lot of the time, platforms use feedback mechanisms that are public in the form of comments, ratings, up-down votes. On Wikipedia, it's in the form of reversions, which are in the public record. And quite a few studies have shown that this kind of public negotiation of the merit of someone's contributions can be quite counterproductive to the motivation to then keep contributing. It might be quite demotivating to be downvoted or to have your Wikipedia contributions reverted. So the question then, from a research perspective, is to what extent is this about the public nature of the feedback process, and to what extent can we create feedback mechanisms that are private and that might have different, that might allow for a different spectrum of feedback outcomes without necessarily the penalties or the harmful effects on motivations. The platform we studied, that Licia and I studied, is the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team, which is an online crowdsourcing platform of now tens of thousands of volunteers who produce maps for humanitarian purposes. And they do this in the form of crowdsourcing interfaces. The screenshots you see here is at the top two pictures of a coordination interface, which they call the tasking manager, where on the top left you see a list of projects that people can choose from. In the center at the top you see one project selected, which then describes this is the specific initiative that this is about, this is the region that we're trying to map. And there is a grid where the map is subdivided into individual tasks. A task is essentially a grid cell that you then select and then take ownership of and then fill in. And then the screenshot in the front on the bottom right, that's the editing interface. It's a map editor using OpenStreetMap. This is essentially similar to a vector drawing diagram. And the work is to trace satellite images, often to trace roads or houses, but it varies by project. Now, one important aspect of the HOT contribution process is what happens after someone submits such a task. HOT has a process that they call validation, which is essentially the purpose of which is essentially a quality control. And specifically what happens there is that someone submits a task that they have completed, and then an expert user can choose to then review that submission and then can respond to that contribution. So, and they have a number of choices in how they respond. The first choice is they can accept or reject the contribution. When a contribution is accepted, the contributor is not told. When it is rejected, the contributor is sent a notification. Your submission has been invalidated. And then additionally, the validator can send a private message where they might want to provide further detail, maybe specific requests for changes or a note of thanks and so on. So our research is really now trying to understand, in a setting like this, where it's much closer to a teacher-learner model rather than the public peer feedback that we usually see on social knowledge production platforms. What is the effect of feedback back there? Do we see the same kind of discouragement when people get negative feedback, or what kinds of outcomes do we get? So the study that we started is really a study in 3 parts, or we're looking at 3 types of questions. First, we want to understand what is the impact of the validation verdict. Does it make a difference whether you get told that your work has been accepted or declined? Second, we want to look at the impact of the validation message when a message is attached. And then third, how important is it that this feedback happens soon, happens quickly? The way we are going about researching this or investigating this is in the form of an observational study. So we were partnering with HOT. So we were given a copy of the database and specifically identified newcomers on the platform, looking at their first contributions before they had any prior exposure to this mapping practice. And then we look at the validation feedback that came in after these early contributions. And then we observe over time, how long do these people stick around? And we observe this retention over an observation window of 45 days. We're doing this in the form of a survival analysis. And then we look at these other validation feedback that came in, and we categorize it. I won't go into the theory. You can have a look at the paper, but we essentially looked at educational science, motivational psychology, in trying to understand what kind of feedback might meaningfully affect someone's attitude, someone's sense of self-efficacy, and so on. And we ended up choosing 5 types of feedback that we then identified by labeling feedback messages. We're looking for performance feedback, and specifically positive or negative performance feedback. Positive performance feedback is a message that says, oh, you did well, this is great work. Negative performance feedback might simply say, you did something wrong there. There's a mistake here, or this is wrong. The third category, the third label is corrective feedback, which gives a form of guidance, which then says, next time, could you please do it this way? Or could you please read this manual, this set of instructions, in order to understand better how to do this thing, and so on. So that is very much something that aims to build self-efficacy. Then as we were looking at the data and talking to validators, we noticed one particular behavior that we hadn't quite seen in the literature, but that we found quite interesting, which we labeled generous acceptance. These are cases where the validator saw actually quite a few mistakes, and then often decided not to invalidate the task because they knew it would be perceived as a rejection, but instead took it on themselves to make those corrections, and then added the message, thank you for your contribution. I made these corrections, and now the work looks good, and then maybe added other, gave some further tips and so on. So we found this quite an interesting behavioral pattern because it kept happening. And we were also wondering, is it worth for validators to put this effort on themselves? And finally, we look at what's called verbal rewards. Verbal rewards is also simply as a way of saying, thank you, you did well, this is a meaningful contribution, you're really helping us out, all these kind of things. And then we collected various control variables. I don't think we'll have quite the time to discuss it in such detail, but you can have a look at the paper for details. So we labeled these 1,300 messages of 1,300 first-time contributors. And this is broadly the breakdown of the kinds of messaging we found. You see the 2 long bars in the middle, negative performance feedback and corrective feedback. These are the most common types of feedback that we saw. So most messages aim to correct mistakes. Most messages say there is something wrong here. And positive performance feedback, generous acceptance, or verbal rewards were much more rare. Just very quickly, there's a survival curve of the overall retention rate. On average, most contributors are not retained. After 30 days, only 6% of the contributors will still be active. I think that's quite typical for online community platforms and for social knowledge production platforms. Here, we are starting to look at the associations between the message and the retention. Here we see the QQ plots of the expected survival given that this specific intervention has taken place or has not taken place. This just allows us to broadly assess, before we build more complex models, this allows us to broadly assess what is the general direction that this intervention might might give us. And here we see that really only 3 of the interventions have an association that's quite clear. Tasks that were accepted are associated with longer survival periods, generous acceptance also, and verbal rewards also. And the other 3 interventions didn't have a clear direction. We saw different kinds of outcomes in different kinds of settings. And then to address the research questions, we built more comprehensive models. Specifically, we're building proportional hazard models, which is a kind of an analog of a regression model, just in order to measure survival. I think the technical details, again, we wouldn't necessarily have time for. You can look at the paper for details. For now, I'll simply report the results. But there's quite a lot of care that went into constructing the models and looking at different versions and different variants. And so on. So the first question was, does the validation verdict make a difference on survival when your work has been accepted or declined? Turns out we didn't see a significant effect on survival. The validation message, we did see a significant effect, however, only in one specific case. For newcomers who contributed relatively little in their early contributions, as measured in the number of hours that they contributed, who received a kind of verbal reward, a message that said thank you, or that said you did well, or this is great. There we saw a significant increase in retention. For the other interventions, we didn't see a statistically significant effect. And then finally, for the third aspect, the time between submission and receiving feedback, does it matter, yes or no? We found it matters. Feedback that is given quickly tends to reduce hazard, tends to increase retention. Briefly to summarize what we found in the study, negative feedback did not harm retention, not in the system that we looked at. On the other hand, positive and effective feedback helps. Verbal rewards were associated with increased retention, and immediate feedback also matters. So what does this mean? This means on one hand that the feedback, or the important element of the feedback, was not necessarily about the nature of the task, in terms of its effects on retention, but what mattered was essentially the social affirmation. It was the fact that someone was telling you, I'm seeing you, and I'm appreciative of your contribution. It's a real message of support. And I think there are now 2 important implications we can draw from this. Maybe contrary to convention, private feedback mechanisms can make a significant difference in certain situations. Sometimes a correction or a rejection of a contribution can feel like a rejection. So, and we don't see that here. And I think that's, from a system design perspective, from a platform design perspective, that's an important property. On the other hand, it also shows that platform designers should really distinguish between quality control and learner feedback. So with HOT, at the time at which we were looking at the system, they've since relaunched their platform, but at that time, the process was specifically focused on quality control. So by default, the workflow was set up to identify the mistakes, essentially counter to the motivational literature, counter to the social effects that we found here. And I think that's an important lesson that platform designers in general can learn from, that sometimes your quality control mechanism and your learner feedback mechanism, you need to reflect about both of these aspects. That's it for me. Thank you very much. And you can find me on Twitter if you have questions, or send me an email. Bye-bye.